Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now let's begin. I'll never forget the night my family sat down for what was supposed to be an ordinary dinner. It was a chilly evening in early October, and we had gathered around the dining table, plates filled, conversation light, the kind of night that should have felt safe, warm, and predictable, but instead it turned into something I still can't explain. We had just started passing dishes around when the doorbell rang. At first, it didn't seem unusual, maybe a neighbor or a delivery mistake, but the timing was strange. We hadn't ordered anything, and no one ever visited us that late in the evening. My dad frowned, hesitating before standing up to check the door. That small pause is burned into my memory. Before he even reached the hallway, my mom checked the security camera on her phone. I leaned closer, not really expecting anything strange. But there he was, a man standing on our front porch, completely still. He wore a dark ski mask that hid his face, and in one hand, partly behind his back, he held something we couldn't make out. My mom's voice cracked when she asked, "Do you know him?" None of us did. He wasn't moving, just staring directly at the door, as if he already knew we were watching him. The porch light barely caught his outline, but there was something deeply unsettling about how calm he seemed. No shifting feet, no nervous movements, just frozen in place. My dad told us to stay put and reach for the door handle. I remember blurting out, "Don't open it." The words came out sharper than I intended, but every part of me screamed that this wasn't someone we wanted inside. Dad paused, reconsidered, and then decided to speak through the door instead. His voice was firm, though I could hear the unease in it. "Can I help you?" he called out. The man didn't answer. He tilted his head slightly like he was studying us through the camera, aware of exactly how uncomfortable he was making us. That silence made the air in the room feel heavier. Even the soft clinking of silverware seemed to vanish. After a long moment, the man finally raised his free hand and slowly curled it into a knock. 3 steady raps against the wood. My mom gasped, clutching her phone tighter. My little sister whispered that she wanted to go upstairs. The man still didn't speak, and I realized he hadn't moved that object from behind his back once. By then, my dad had backed away from the door. He looked at us, uncertain, and then reached for his phone to call the police. I could see his hands trembling, something I had never seen before. We all sat in silence, watching the frozen figure on the camera, waiting for something, anything to happen. That was when the man finally leaned closer to the camera, pressing his mask against the lens. It was sudden and jarring, a distorted view of his covered face filling the screen. For a split second, it felt like he was staring directly into our dining room, breaking the invisible barrier of safety we thought we had. My mom dropped her phone when the masked man pressed against the camera. It clattered loudly on the table, startling all of us. My sister was crying now, and my dad told her to go upstairs, but she refused to leave without him. I just sat frozen, unable to process why this was happening at our front door. When my dad finally got through to 911, he tried to explain the situation calmly. The operator asked if the man had a weapon. Dad admitted we couldn't see what he was holding behind his back. The operator told us to stay inside and lock every entry point until officers arrived. That reassurance felt thin with the man just feet away. The longer he stood there, the more wrong it felt. He hadn't knocked again, hadn't spoken, hadn't moved. It was like he was waiting for something, almost feeding on the tension inside our house. Every passing second stretched endlessly as we watched his shadow on the porch. Suddenly, the porch light flickered. For a brief moment, the feed glitched, and when it returned, the man was gone. My mom gasped, frantically adjusting the camera, but the porch was empty. My dad rushed to check the windows, his voice sharp as he told us not to move. My stomach twisted with dread. I knew he hadn't left. Sure enough, moments later, a faint scraping noise echoed from the side of the house. It was subtle, like metal dragging against siding, but unmistakable. My dad whispered to the operator, describing what we heard. The operator promised officers were close, but that didn't ease the terror clawing at me. We all held our breath, listening. The scraping stopped, replaced by a faint knock, this time on the window nearest the dining room. My head whipped toward the sound, and I saw his masked face just barely visible in the reflection of the glass. He wasn't trying to break in. He was trying to terrify us. My dad shouted for him to leave, his voice trembling more than I'd ever heard. The man only tilted his head again, his mask blank but somehow full of menace. He tapped on the window softly, a rhythm that felt mocking, like he knew exactly how helpless we were behind the glass. Just when I thought I couldn't take the pressure anymore, red and blue lights flashed outside. The man backed away from the window slowly, then vanished into the shadows of the yard. My mom rushed to unlock the door for the arriving officers, but my gut told me the night wasn't over yet. 2 officers entered the house, trying to calm everyone down as they checked the property. My dad explained everything, showing them the security footage on my mom's phone. The officers exchanged uneasy looks but didn't say much. They assured us the man was gone, though their eyes told a different story. We all sat back at the table, food untouched, listening as the officers searched outside. My mom tried to comfort my sister, but she wouldn't stop shaking. I stared at the window where the man's face had appeared, half expecting him to return at any second. The silence in that room felt unbearable. Minutes later, one of the officers returned saying they hadn't found anyone, but they had noticed fresh footprints in the damp soil leading around the house. The tracks circled our home more than once before disappearing into the woods behind our property. It was confirmation of what we already feared. He'd been watching us. The officer stayed a little longer, advising us to keep the doors locked and call immediately if anything else happened. When they finally left, my dad double-checked every lock in the house. We tried to sit down again, but the mood was gone. Every sound outside made us flinch, and dinner sat cold on our plates. I couldn't bring myself to eat. My mind kept replaying the man's blank mask pressed against the camera, the sound of his tapping on the glass. It wasn't random. It felt intentional, like he knew exactly how to get under our skin. That kind of patience and control was far more terrifying than any outburst of violence. Eventually, my parents sent us to bed, though I knew none of us would really sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, every creak of the house making my heart race. I kept checking my phone for notifications from the camera, terrified I'd see him standing there again. The hours dragged endlessly. At some point, exhaustion took over and I must have dozed off. But around 3 hours in the morning, I woke to a faint vibration on my nightstand. My phone lit up with a notification from the security app. Motion detected at the front door. I froze, afraid to even breathe as I unlocked the screen. The feed opened, and there he was, standing in the exact same spot, ski mask in place, still holding something behind his back. Only this time, he wasn't looking at the door. He was looking directly at the camera, his head tilted, as if he knew I was the one watching from my bed. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. I still remember that night in Michigan more vividly than I want to. It was one of those family dinners my aunt loved to host, the kind where every cousin, uncle, and distant relative packed into her house. I wasn't thrilled about going, but I knew I couldn't make excuses forever. I had no idea that night would stick with me for years in the worst way possible. The house itself was warm, filled with the smell of roasted turkey and chatter spilling from every corner. I sat near the dining table scrolling on my phone when my cousin Jason walked in with someone none of us had seen before. He didn't introduce him right away, just waved awkwardly and headed toward the table. At first, we all assumed he was just a college friend. What unsettled me almost immediately was how silent the guest was. He didn't smile, didn't greet anyone, and barely acknowledged the people around him. He just sat at the far end of the table and stared at the empty plate in front of him. Nobody seemed to question it, but the air shifted in a way I can't explain. I leaned over to my sister and whispered, asking if she knew who the guy was. She shook her head, her expression mirroring my confusion. Jason, meanwhile, carried on like nothing was strange, laughing with my uncle about something unrelated. I wanted to brush it off, but something about that quiet figure gnawed at me. Dinner went on as usual. Plates passed around, drinks poured, the sound of clinking silverware filling the room. But every time I looked down the table, I noticed the guest wasn't eating. He just sat motionless, eyes fixed on the middle of the table as if waiting for something. Nobody else seemed to care, which made it even worse. Halfway through the meal, my aunt tried to make small talk, asking him where he was from. He finally lifted his head and smiled faintly, but didn't say a single word. That smile was wrong, though. It lingered too long, like he was amused by something we couldn't see. My stomach tightened and I suddenly lost my appetite. I thought maybe Jason would at least explain, so I asked him quietly who his friend was. His response froze me. He looked confused, then laughed nervously, saying he hadn't brought anyone. My chest tightened as I pointed toward the end of the table, but when Jason turned to look, the chair was empty. The guest was gone. The room suddenly felt colder, though no one else seemed to notice. My sister nudged me, whispering that I was just imagining things. But I knew what I saw, and I wasn't the only one. Across the table, my aunt's face had gone pale, her eyes darting between me and the empty chair. She had seen him too. For a long moment, the conversation at the table died down, the air thick with a silence that didn't belong at a family dinner. It was the kind of quiet that pressed against your chest and made it hard to breathe. My aunt excused herself to the kitchen, but I could see her hands trembling as she carried the serving tray. That's when I realized this wasn't going to be an ordinary night. After the chair turned up empty, I kept glancing down the table, half expecting him to reappear. My fork hovered above my plate, untouched, while the laughter around me felt forced. Jason kept asking what was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to explain. I didn't want everyone to think I was losing it. Still, my aunt's reaction lingered in the back of my mind. She wasn't the type to rattle easily, and yet I had seen the color drain from her face. When she returned from the kitchen, she avoided eye contact with me completely. That was when I knew she wasn't just pretending. She had seen him too. The rest of the family carried on with dinner like nothing had happened. I watched my cousins talk about football games and college classes, but none of it registered. My eyes kept flicking to that chair, the one that had been occupied only moments ago. It remained empty, yet something about it felt heavier than before. I finally leaned toward my aunt when no one else was looking and whispered, asking if she knew who that man was. Her lips tightened and she shook her head quickly, almost warning me not to say more. That response chilled me more than anything. It felt like she knew something but didn't want it spoken aloud. I tried to distract myself by eating, but every bite tasted strange, like the food had gone stale. My stomach turned, and when I glanced at my glass of water, I swore I saw ripples forming inside it, like something had brushed against the table. I blinked, and the water was still again, leaving me questioning myself. Just as I tried to settle down, the lights flickered for the first time. It was quick, barely a second, but long enough for everyone to pause mid-conversation. When they came back on, I looked down the table and nearly dropped my fork. The chair wasn't empty anymore. He was sitting there again, staring straight at me. This time I couldn't hold it in. I whispered to my sister, asking if she saw him. She glanced nervously and nodded, her face paling as she gripped my arm under the table. Relief that I wasn't alone was instantly crushed by the fear in her eyes. She saw him too, and that meant he was real. The worst part was how none of the other relatives reacted. Jason kept laughing with another cousin, and my uncle was busy telling a story as if nothing unusual was happening. It was like the guest existed only in our corner of the table. That made me feel trapped, isolated, and vulnerable in my own family's home. I avoided looking at him for the rest of the meal, but I could feel his eyes on me. It was the kind of stare that crawled under your skin, cold and heavy, making every bite harder to swallow. When the lights flickered a second time, I braced myself, and just like before, the chair was empty again. The second disappearance left me frozen in place, fork still clutched in my hand. My sister kept her eyes fixed on the chair, gripping the edge of the table like she might bolt at any second. I wanted to ask my aunt what was happening, but her expression told me she wouldn't answer. The weight of silence pressed heavier than the laughter around us. A few relatives started clearing their plates, acting as if the dinner was ending normally. I couldn't understand how they didn't notice the shifts in the room, the flickers, the sudden chills, the empty chair that wasn't always empty. My sister and I exchanged uneasy glances. We were the only ones acknowledging the wrongness that clung to the house. Then the lights flickered again, longer this time. For 2 or 3 seconds, everything was swallowed in darkness. When they returned, the guest was back in the chair, but now he wasn't still. He leaned forward slightly, his faint smile stretching wider, eyes locked directly onto mine. My skin crawled under his gaze. I couldn't eat anymore. I couldn't even breathe right. Every instinct in me screamed to leave, but I felt glued to the chair. My aunt's hands shook as she gathered dishes, clearly desperate to end the night. She still wouldn't look at me, though, like she already knew what I was seeing. When my uncle cracked a joke to lighten the mood, my sister jumped in her seat. I followed her eyes and saw what made her flinch. The guest wasn't sitting anymore. He was standing directly behind Jason, motionless, his face blank except for that unnatural grin. Jason never noticed. He just kept talking, completely unaware. I opened my mouth to shout, but before a sound could escape, the lights flickered once more. This time they stayed off longer. The room was wrapped in a darkness so thick it felt alive. I heard the scrape of a chair moving, slow and deliberate, followed by the faintest whisper brushing against my ear. When the lights finally returned, the guest was gone again. Jason looked confused, glancing behind him as if he'd felt something but couldn't place it. My sister squeezed my arm, her nails digging into my skin, silently begging me not to say a word. Nobody else at the table looked alarmed. The night ended abruptly after that. People left with hugs and casual goodbyes like it had been any other dinner. But as I walked out, I couldn't shake the feeling that the guest was still in that house, waiting for the next gathering. I avoided family dinners for months after. Even now, years later, I wonder if he'll show up again. Family dinners in Washington always carried a certain warmth, the kind where you could smell fresh bread even before walking through the door. I had been invited to my best friend Ryan's family dinner, something his parents hosted every few weeks. The moment I stepped inside, I noticed how cozy the house felt compared to the cold drizzle outside. Yet, even then, a strange unease clung to me, though I couldn't explain why. The dining room buzzed with chatter, the clinking of silverware and bursts of laughter. Ryan's parents welcomed me like family, and for a while, everything felt perfectly normal. I took my seat at the long wooden table, scanning the faces around me. Most I barely recognized. It was the kind of gathering where you felt both comforted and out of place. When the bread basket finally reached me, I reached for it without thinking. But as my hand brushed inside, I froze. It wasn't the bread I touched, it was a hand. Cold. Human. Unnaturally cold. My chest tightened. I looked up instantly, but no one was reaching for the basket. Everyone's hands were busy with forks and knives. I pulled my hand back quickly, forcing a nervous laugh when Ryan asked if I was okay. I told him I had dropped my napkin, but I knew what I'd felt. Skin, fingers, a weight that gripped mine for just a second too long. The next few minutes blurred together. The conversations around me became distant, laughter sounding hollow. I couldn't take my eyes off the basket, it just sat there, ordinary and untouched. But that icy feeling stayed with me. I told myself it was probably Ryan or his younger brother messing around, but when I checked, Ryan was on my left, his brother across the table. Both of their hands were visible. Neither looked like they had noticed anything strange. That left me with a question I didn't want to answer. If it wasn't them, then who? Ryan's mom offered me more potatoes, snapping me out of my thoughts. I nodded quickly, pretending to be fine, though my palms were slick with sweat. Every laugh, every clink of a glass made me flinch. I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was waiting to happen, that the cold touch hadn't been an accident. Then, in the middle of Ryan's dad's story, the lights dimmed. Not flickered, just softened, like the room itself was exhaling. Nobody commented on it. That silence made it worse. I glanced at the basket again. For just a moment, I thought I saw it move, like something inside had shifted on its own. I rubbed my eyes, telling myself I was tired, but when I looked back, Ryan was staring at me. His expression wasn't confused. It was knowing. That look crawled under my skin. I tried to distract myself by sipping water, but even the glass trembled in my hand. The more I thought about it, the more wrong the whole night began to feel. The laughter, the chatter, it all sounded rehearsed. Like everyone was part of a script I hadn't been given. I scanned the table again. Most of them weren't even making eye contact, just staring down at their plates, moving mechanically like mannequins pretending to eat. Then Ryan leaned closer, whispering, "Did you feel it?" My fork froze halfway to my mouth. Before I could reply, his mother called his name, and he sat upright again like nothing had happened. My pulse pounded. He knew. The breadbasket was being passed again. This time, I refused to touch it. But when it reached Ryan, he hesitated, his hand hovering just above the rolls as if he understood what it carried. Then slowly, he pulled back. That hesitation chilled me more than anything. I looked around the table again. That's when I noticed him, a man sitting at the far end. Unfamiliar. His face seemed ordinary, but I couldn't hold his features in my memory. Each time I blinked, he looked slightly different. Brown hair one moment, black the next. He didn't eat, didn't drink. He just stared at the breadbasket. No one else acknowledged him, not even Ryan's parents. It was as if he'd always been there. The air near him felt colder. Ryan caught me staring and gave a slight shake of his head, almost a warning. That tiny gesture told me everything. I wasn't supposed to notice him. My skin prickled. The stranger's eyes met mine, and though his lips never moved, I swear I saw a smile. I looked away instantly, pretending to focus on my food, but suddenly the smell of dinner turned metallic, heavy. My appetite vanished. Every sound in the room grew distant, except for the creak of wooden chairs when someone shifted. But the stranger never moved. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket, making me jump. I glanced down. It was a text from Ryan. "Don't touch the bread again." My throat went dry. When I looked up, Ryan avoided my gaze. That's when I realized, whatever this was, he'd known for a long time. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, pretending nothing was wrong. The stranger's stare felt like a weight pressing against my chest. I wanted to leave, but standing up felt impossible. Finally, Ryan spoke, his tone strained. "Mom, can we be excused?" His mother forced a smile and nodded, but her eyes flicked toward the stranger before she looked back at her plate. We stood, and I swore I saw the man's head turn slightly, following our movement. The hallway outside was darker than before. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the floor. Ryan led me into the kitchen, his whisper sharp and trembling. "He's not supposed to be here," he said, face pale. "No one else notices him. They never do." My chest tightened. "Who is he?" I asked. Ryan shook his head violently. "Don't say his name," he muttered, though he hadn't told me one. There was certainty in his voice, like he'd lived with this for years. The kitchen was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. For a brief moment, I thought we were safe. Then the overhead light flickered. Ryan froze. His eyes went to the doorway. We hadn't heard footsteps, but somehow the stranger was standing there just beyond the frame. He didn't move or speak. The temperature dropped instantly, our breath visible in the air. Now I understood. This wasn't about ignoring him. It was about acceptance. Ryan grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the back door. The hinges groaned as we shoved it open, cold night air hitting us like a slap. We ran until we reached the far edge of the yard before turning back. The dining room glowed faintly through the windows. Inside, Ryan's family was still eating, moving in the same perfect rhythm as if nothing had changed. Then my phone buzzed again. A new message. "You shouldn't have left the table." That night I didn't sleep. The memory of that freezing hand and the stranger's silent smile haunted me. Ryan never spoke of it again, and I never asked. Some truths are too dangerous to say out loud. To this day, I refuse to eat dinner in that house again. I avoid that street entirely whenever I'm in Washington. But sometimes, when I reach for bread at my own dinner table, I swear I feel a cold hand brush against mine.